want to thank everybody for joining us for the 10th annual Summit on Volunteerism and Civic Engagement, which is absolutely astounding to me that this has been going on so long. I'm not nearly old enough to have been participating in summits for 10 years. Just kidding. So, the roots of the Summit on Volunteerism and Civic Engagement really, it was a group of stakeholders meeting in a coffee shop and said, hey, why aren't we convening on a larger scale and bringing folks together to learn from each other, to grow, and to share new ideas and best practices. And over time, the summit has evolved into quite an event. We are looking at this year about 150 folks participating in each of the workshops happening over the next 4 days, which we're really excited about. It does look a little bit different this year. Normally, we're convening at the ASU West campus and sharing meals and networking. And this year, like many events, we have shifted to a virtual platform. The one blessing, I think, with that is that it makes it much more accessible for folks to be able to join the session both as participants as well as workshop presenters. And that leads me into welcoming our first presenter for the virtual summit, Crystal Petrie. Crystal is from Texas and runs the RSVP program there. She was born and raised in Orange, Texas, and is a 1998 graduate of West Orange Start High School. And then she attended Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, where she received a bachelor's in communications. She has her master's from Gonzaga University in communications and leadership. She's married with 3 kids and currently lives in Beaumont. She's the director of Golden Triangle Retired and Senior Volunteer Program, where she oversees close to 500 volunteers throughout Orange, Jefferson, and Hardin County. Crystal loves sports, the color purple, and trying new things. So welcome, Crystal. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I will go ahead and get your slides started.
So much for that wonderful introduction, Emily. Who wrote that? I mean, it's amazing.
Somebody with a background in communications, for sure. All right. And do you have your presentation up there, Crystal? Can you see it?
No, I can't see it. It says loading on my end.
Oh, goodness gracious.
And I'll just say slide so you'll know when to advance.
Okay. Are we still loading?
No, it's up now.
Oh, okay. Okay. Perfect. Take it away.
Okay, well, again, thank you so much, Emily, for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to thank the Office of Youth and Faith and Family for even allowing me to come in from Texas and present at the 10-year anniversary of this event. So, okay, my slides just went away.
Yes, I see that. Give me just a minute here. Clicking too many buttons.
As you said, I'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, but I'll also have time at the end of the presentation for questions as well. So if you have questions as I'm speaking, please feel free to put those in the chat and I will address them as I can. And I will also address any questions or comments as well at the end of the presentation also. I am very excited to be able to present this, and I truly hope it's something
Oh, I got it. Thank you. Goodbye. Say hi.
Take away.
That was Crystal. I accidentally muted you. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Trying to grab folks here as they're dialing on.
We're all still
okay.
used to virtual.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it might be about to come back up. The word for 2020 truly is pivot. You are correct. The second one is patience. Yes, you are correct.
So true. And we thank you all for your patience for sure.
We need one more P, someone. We have pivot, patience. We need one more P word. Pivot, patience.
Perseverance.
Perseverance.
I was trying to type that in. He jumped right in there.
Pivot, patience, and perseverance. That is it for 2020 and maybe 2020.
I see perspective in there and prosperity as well.
Yes. Okay, are we ready?
I think so. Do you see your slides there?
Yes, I see the first one.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily, and everyone else. Again, my name is Crystal Petrie, and I am the Director of Golden Triangle, or SVP. And I am going to speak about how to make sure that your volunteer pool, as well as your advisory council, is inclusive, equally inclusive. So, first slide, why are Caucasian volunteers so massive? Is it because minorities do not volunteer? Is it because the Caucasian race values volunteering more than the minority ethnicity? According to a 2015 Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then that's the name, of course, it states that among the majority of ethnicity groups, Caucasian volunteers continue to volunteer at a higher rate. While the numbers for minorities who volunteer are significantly lower, it still answers the question, yes, minorities do volunteer. Slide, please. And then this is just a breakdown of the numbers. Now, again, this was in 2015. And then whenever these statistics come out for the latest census, of course, these numbers will be updated. But African Americans volunteer at 19%, Asians volunteer at 17%, Hispanics volunteer at 15%, and Caucasians volunteer at 26%. Now, what I want to say about these numbers are a bit skewed. And what I mean by that is the numbers that we see before us are numbers of people who are volunteering within an organized volunteer group. So, for example, African Americans who volunteer within AmeriCorps, or African Americans who volunteer with perhaps St. Jude or something like that, where they can actually be counted and reported. What I have discovered as I have gone out into my community to make sure my volunteer pool is inclusive is that African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, minorities volunteer, but more than likely they are volunteering in their own communities where they are not necessarily being counted, if you will. So they're volunteering at their churches, they're volunteering at their civic groups, they're volunteering at their social organizations, they're volunteering to pick up the trash in their communities, they're volunteering at schools and different things like that where they're not being counted. So these numbers are for organizations like with mine, RSVP, Retired and Senior Volunteer Program, where we have to turn in a specific number of volunteers every 6 months. So that's why these numbers are a bit skewed. So I just want you to hear that and recognize that before we go on. Next slide, please. So this is my personal ideology when it comes to volunteer pools. And I know we're talking about volunteers, but this can be in the for-profit and nonprofit. This will continue throughout any area where you are working. My ideology or assumption is that the lack of inclusiveness within volunteers is not viewed as improper, immoral, or wrong by the vast majority of Americans. Therefore, it is fixed, inflexible, and unquestioned. As I worked on this project, it occurs to me that the first objective must be to get the vast majority of Americans to see that there is a clear problem when not just volunteers, but any group of people is primarily one ethnicity. Then once that is identified, then we can work on the strategic change to fix it. So basically, what I'm saying here, what my thought process is, whenever people look at volunteer pools or advisory councils or executive boards, and it's just one ethnicity. So it's just all African Americans or it's just all Caucasians. No one sees that as a problem. All they see is, oh, people are volunteering, which is wonderful. We want people to volunteer. But if all of your volunteers are just primarily one ethnicity, that's a problem. That something is wrong with that. But right now, and thankfully with Emily and everyone else in the Office of the Governor for allowing me to present this, we can start seeing that if my volunteer pool is all African American, then something's wrong with that and it absolutely needs to be fixed. So through education, through training, hopefully that's something that we all can start working on. Next slide, please. So before I start right here, Randy, I just want to see, are there any questions in the chat that I can answer now?
No, we don't have any so far.
Excellent. Okay, so as was in my introduction, I am the director of Golden Triangle Retired and Senior Volunteer Program, or SVP. So in 2014, when I was promoted to director of this program, this was my breakdown. So as you can see, I had 6 Hispanic or Latino volunteers, 508 non-Hispanic or non-Latino, no American Indian, no Alaskan Native, 99 African Americans, 2 Native Hawaiians, and 404 Caucasian volunteers. Now, again, I have well over 500 volunteers, and I am proud and I love every single one of them. But when I look at these numbers, and hopefully when you look at these numbers, you can see that something is definitely wrong with that. When over 90% of my volunteers are one race. And again, it goes back to my ideology that no one sees this as a problem, but it absolutely is. And I put in a few pictures of my volunteers. Here's some of them right here out at an event that we were hosting. And as we go through, I would like for you to pay attention to how the pictures of my volunteers changed over time. So right now we have 6 volunteers in this picture, 5 female Caucasian, 1 male. And that's generally the breakdown that I had when I first came on as director of RSVP. Next slide, please. Okay, so things I want you to learn and take away from this presentation. Number one, I want you to actively look at your volunteer pool and your advisory council demographics. What do you see? A better question, who do you see? So for me, when I looked at my volunteer pool, when I looked at my advisory council, I saw, number one, people who are willing to give of their time, give of their energy, give of their community. And for that, I am forever grateful. And I will always be very passionate and loving about RSVP and my volunteers. But I also saw the majority of all of my volunteers and my advisory council were primarily female Caucasians. Number two, purposely recruit for an equally inclusive volunteer pool. So I'm going to give you some tangible ways to recruit for an inclusive volunteer pool that you can literally start working on today, as soon as my presentation is over anyway. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the assumption can be made that people are unaware of the social norm to target a certain group of people to volunteer. But the assumption can also be made that some people fight to preserve past and current social norms. So basically, what Mr. Newman is saying is, and it goes back to my ideology, people do not realize. So for me, for example, most people do not realize that as a Black African American female, that I will target Black African American females because they're in likeness to me. So as a Caucasian female, most people do not realize that that's who they are targeting because that person looks like them, speaks like them, thinks like them, sounds like them. But Mr. Norman also makes the argument that some people do realize that and they still continue to recruit people who only look like them, who only sound like them, and who only think like them. And that's something that they want to preserve. And what I would like to add as we're looking at this slide, yes, it is unconscious bias. Thank you so much for that comment, Jamie. What I would like to add is that recruiting people who do not look like you, who do not sound like you, who do not think like you is not a hindrance in any way to you or your organization. The only thing that will do is make you better and make your organization better. So it does not diminish your organization. It does not diminish your volunteer pool to be inclusive in your recruitment and to be inclusive in your volunteer pool. Next slide, please. And as we're waiting for Miss Emily to go to the next slide, I just oh, there we go. And again, as we are going through this presentation, I put in pictures of my volunteers as the look, if you will, started to change. So as I started being on purpose, recruiting inclusively, my volunteer pool started to change. And I want to make sure that you guys recognize that and acknowledge that. Next slide, please. Okay, with a targeted approach using a multimedia platform, having an equally inclusive volunteer pool can easily be fixed. The approach that I am recommending is not a quick fix approach. With time, effort, and a small or large amount of money, depending on your budget, your volunteer pool, whether nonprofit or for profit, will add value to your community and help expand your services. So, here, and we'll get into this later, I am going to give you some tangible ways to be more inclusive with your volunteer recruitment and give you some tangible ways to recruit in a respectful manner. We have all, hopefully, we've all seen or heard of like these big national organizations that are trying to be inclusive, but what they end up doing is being very disrespectful to a certain culture or a certain ethnicity that they are trying to target. So, I am going to tell you ways on how you can recruit and how you can target the minority volunteers without it being disrespectful. And the things that I'm going to give you, you can do with zero to very little money or budget, or you can also implement it if you have a large budget. So, depending on what your budget is, you can implement all of the information that I am going to give you. But I want to stress that this is not a quick fix approach. This is not something that you can start on today, March 15th, and then you see huge turnaround by next month. This is something that's going to take time, it's going to take energy, and it's going to take continuous effort. And a lot of people, and that's just the generation that we live in, they want quick results. This is not that. This is not going to be a quick result, quick fix. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience. One of our P words from earlier, it's going to take time and it's going to take patience for this to be successful for your organization. So I definitely want to point that out to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just a few of the things that I have used. Now, these are things that I use in my recruitments. So, how do you recruit an equally inclusive volunteer pool? These are just five ways, like five of the main ways that I do it. There are several more that I use as well. And one thing that I want to stress and I want to point out that if you have questions after this, I would love for you guys to reach out to me. If you run into maybe a roadblock or something, please reach out to me even after this presentation. And I would love to walk with you and work with you on creating an inclusive volunteer pool for your organization. So, number one, go to the neighborhoods of African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, etc. So, basically, go to the neighborhoods of minorities, go to the neighborhoods of the people that you are trying to target. So, one thing I will tell you about this when you start doing this is that most communities and most minority communities are not easily acceptable of people that have not always been in their community, meaning kind of stranger danger, what we tell our children. It still applies even today. So even myself, when I went into especially the Hispanic community and the Asian community, they were not very receptive of me at the beginning. They were not rude, they were not disrespectful, but they were not really receptive of what I had to say. So what I had to do is continuously make myself available to that community. I had to continuously go back to that community, make phone calls, send emails, participate in the activities and events in that community. And basically, what I was doing was building trust in that community and building rapport in that community. And I will tell you, that was not something that was done overnight. That took, I would say, maybe about a year if I had to put a time on it, of me continuously going back, speaking to the people in the community, speaking to the leaders in that community, being a part of different events that they held in that community. And what I eventually found was two things that happened. One, the first thing that started happening was I started being invited, which was huge because before I was seeking out um, the events. I was seeking out the opportunity to be a part of that community. And then the first thing that started happening was I started being invited. So they would call me and ask, do you want to come out and present at this event? Do you want to come out and be a part of this event? So I was very excited because right then and there, I knew that I started getting their trust. I started getting their respect. And then, yes, perseverance, TJ, perseverance. Um, and then the second thing that started happening after I started receiving the invitations was people started asking about how they could be a part of my volunteer organization. So initially, when I was going in, I was asking for people to start volunteering and giving them all the wonderful reasons they need to volunteer with the RSVP. And I wouldn't say that it was falling on deaf ears, but I was not getting a return on my investments. But once I started gaining their trust and their rapport, they started coming to me and wanting to be a part of my organization. So again, go to these neighborhoods. And if you don't know where these neighborhoods are in your community, you can Google that. Um, Look in the newspaper, find out what events are going on in those communities. Well, I don't even know if people read newspapers anymore, but you can go on social media, go to like your local newspaper or your local television or your local radio social media account and see what's going on in those communities and then find a way inside. Number two, go to the schools. Go to the schools of the people that you are trying to target. And that's part of being in those neighborhoods. So once you find yourself in those neighborhoods, then you can find out the schools that are in those neighborhoods and find out the meetings. I know in Texas, and I'm sure around the US, we have retired teachers association, retired school personnel association. And what you can do, and this is what I did, is I just got on Google and I Googled retired teacher meetings in my area. And it pulled up the meetings for all of the retired teachers associations in my area. And then they give you a name, they give you a phone number, they give you the address. And so I just called every person on the list and asked if I can come out and speak at their next meeting. And so that was something else that I started doing. And again, I'm going to keep I'm going to keep on it that this is not an overnight deal. A lot of the people that I called when I called about going to the Retired Teachers Association or going to the Retired School Personnel Association, I was turned down like the first time I called, the second time I called, but I kept calling, and eventually those no's turned into yeses. And then from those yeses, they turned into invitations. So with the retired school teachers, retired school personnel, they started calling me and asking me to be keynote speakers at their events. When initially, they would tell me, well, if we have time at the end of the meeting, you can get up and speak for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then that turned into, would you be our keynote speaker for next month? Would you come in and present for next month? Would you come in and host for next month? So I continued to call, even though I received no's initially, but I continued to call. And any time that they spoke, that they gave me time to speak, whether that was 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I used that time to the best of my ability and made great use of it. And from there, people started coming up to me and asking, how can we be a part of your organization? How can we be a part of your advisory council? So some people didn't necessarily want to volunteer, but they wanted to be on the advisory council to help make decisions about the volunteers. So either way, you can get targeted minorities into your volunteer pool, except that some people did not want to volunteer. They wanted to be on the advisory council. Some people didn't want to be on the advisory council. They wanted to volunteer. So whenever they come and they want to be a part of your organization, please make room for them to be a part of your organization. Number 3, get public service announcements or PSAs played on different radio stations. Most people do not know, but every single radio station across the country has to, and it's part of their contractual obligation, they have to run PSAs for nonprofit organizations. And these have to be free. So the radio station cannot charge nonprofit organizations for running a PSA. Now, the thing that comes with the PSA is you will never know when that PSA will run. Since you're not a paid advertiser per se, they can run the PSA when they want to. So sometimes your PSA will run at 12 p.m., lunchtime, that's prime time, or 8 a.m. Sometimes your PSA will run at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning. So whenever that radio station has open space, they will put in your PSA. Now, in my experience, I had to write my own PSA, and they give you 30 seconds to write it. So you have to be able to communicate effectively exactly what you want and what you're asking of your audience in 30 seconds. So I had to write my own PSA, 30 seconds, and then I went to the radio station and I recorded my PSA. And from there, they ran it on the different radio stations. And again, trying to figure out what radio stations are in your area, what target audience that radio station has. Google became my best friend, and I would ask that Google becomes your best friend when you are recruiting for an inclusive volunteer pool. So basically, I just Googled all the radio stations in my area. You could go to their website and they will show you, you can read their website and figure out for yourself who's listening to their music. So what audience is listening to their music? And then you just call them, you ask for the program director. And from there, you can start working on getting your PSA played on the radio station for free. For free. Number 4, get articles written in different newspapers and magazines or on their social media platform. And so what I did was I reached out to the Hispanic community because I knew that they have a very widely read and viewed newspaper magazine in my area. So I reached out to the editor of different magazines, there's several magazines and newspapers in my area. I reached out to them and spoke to them. And one of the things that happened, and this was amazing, is that when I reached out and spoke to them, they had already heard of me and they had already heard about my organization. And the reason that they had heard of me and they knew about my organization was because of number one, because I was in those communities, because I was participating in those events, because they had established trust and respect for me. My name and my organization started traveling in different areas and different circles in those communities. So by the time I got to number four, literally, they had heard of me and they had heard of my organization. And they were more than willing for me to place an article in their newspaper. So I did not have to pay for this. All I had to do was write out the article. They gave me a word count. So if you guys are familiar with newspapers and magazines, their articles are based on the number of words. So they gave me a word count that I had to meet. I wrote out my article and submitted it to them. They even translated my article into Spanish for the newspaper and for the magazine. And then again, what started happening was they started reaching out to me for articles. So if something came up about that affected volunteers, or if something came up that affected senior citizens, because with the RSVP, you have to be at least 55 or older to volunteer, they would reach out to me for an article or they would reach out to me for a quote. So I became their person for volunteers and I became their person for information about senior citizens. But that all started with the first thing, getting into those communities, establishing trust, establishing rapport, and talking about my organization. So I talked about RSVP. I talked about the benefits of volunteering with RSVP. And I had to make them see that, yes, you volunteer in your communities, but you can also make a difference and make an impact with volunteering within RSVP. And then number five, of course, is use social media. If you do not have some kind of social media platform, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever that is, YouTube, LinkedIn, please create some kind of social media platform. Of course, with um, if you have to get approval, get that approval first and then start that social media platform. I had to get approval for my executive director, and then I was able to start my social media platform. And on social media, whenever I posted pictures or video or anything like that, I made sure that the community that I was targeting, which was African Americans, Hispanic, Asian Americans, that they were front and center. Now, this is why I want to stress that you do not want to do this in a disrespectful way. So, if you have maybe one African American volunteer or two African American volunteers, and those are the only people that you're showing, you don't want to use them, is what I'm trying to say. But put them, show them in their element, show them volunteering. Let them speak about how much they love volunteering and how much they love volunteering in your organization. Or even for Hispanics or Asian Americans, whatever that person is, or whoever that person is. And this applies to men as well, because within my volunteer pool, I had several hundred women, but only a handful of men. So this was the same thing I did. So the men that I had, I started making them front and center. When I would go out and speak, I would make sure and bring a man to speak with me, or I would make sure and bring an African American volunteer or a Hispanic volunteer to speak with me. And I put them front and center I showed them that they were valuable to our organization, and I showed my community that they were valuable to my community. And you can do this without having to say, look at my African American volunteer. You can do this without having to say, look at my Hispanic volunteer or look at my male volunteer. You can do this by just showing them that they're valuable, bringing them and putting the spotlight on them. I have a perfect example of this. One of the very few African American men that I had within my volunteer pool, I invited him to come out and speak with me at an event. And he was so excited, like verbally, visibly excited about the opportunity to come and speak. And so I was like, why are you? I mean, it just caught me off guard. So I was like, why are you so excited about coming to speak? And his words really hit me. He said, because no one has ever asked, no one has ever invited me to do something like this. And this African American male had been volunteering with RSVP over 15 years, and no one had ever asked or invited him to come and speak. So when I invited him, he was so excited, visibly, verbally. And when he got to the event to tell his story, I mean, it was just amazing. Even for me as the director, I was amazed at his story and why he chose to volunteer and why he kept volunteering within my organization day after day, year after year. So give the people that you have in your volunteer pool the opportunity to tell their story on a platform. And even if, for example, your volunteer pool is all African Americans or all Hispanics, do the same thing with your Caucasian volunteer. Make them feel valued. Let them know that you value them, that you value their story, that you value the wisdom and knowledge that they bring to your organization. So, again, if you have a volunteer pool and everyone is African American and you have maybe 4 or 5 Caucasian volunteers or 4 or 5 Hispanic volunteers, put them on the platform. Let them know that they are important to you, they are important to the community. Let them tell their story, let them share their story. And that is how you show value to that volunteer. That is how you show to the community that you value your Caucasian volunteers, that you value your Hispanic volunteers without it being disrespectful and without you blatantly saying, look at my Caucasian volunteer, because that's not what you want to do. You want your volunteers to be empowered. You want them to be valued. And that's how you do that. That's how you do that. Next slide, please.
Crystal, while I'm advancing this slide, I'm going to ask Randy if he can share a couple of questions that came in from the chat box.
Perfect.
I certainly can. We had some good comments about local resources that people may want to look at. And Krista, we do have a handful of questions for you. The first was just asking if you'd had if you'd had success working with city council members in the neighborhoods that you had been recruiting in.
With city council, initially that was difficult because with elected officials, they are being pulled in so many different directions, and I respect that and I honor that. But what I did was I continued to call. I continued to knock on the doors. I continued to email them. And eventually I received the attention of them. And they started inviting me out to different events that they were hosting. And one of the things I did with elected officials, and this was just kind of a backdoor thing that I did, I have a electronic newsletter that I send out every other month. And what I did was I got the emails of all of the elected local officials in my area, and I put their email on my distribution list. So they started getting my emails consistently about the great work that RSVP was doing in their community. And they were able to see their own constituents volunteering and working to make the community a better place. And then they started calling me, they started emailing me, and they started wanting to be a part of RSVP as much as they were able to do that. So that's something that I would suggest if you have an electronic newsletter or something or some kind of distribution list that's highlighting what you're doing in your community. Get your elected local officials' email addresses and put it on there. And they will start seeing what you are doing in the community and they will want to be a part of that.
Cool. Thank you for that. The next question is, when you were invited for speaking engagements, did you speak only about your organization, or did you sometimes talk about another relevant topic for the community?
That's an excellent question. So the majority of the time I was speaking about RSVP. Now, whenever I started becoming like the keynote speaker for different events, especially for elected local official events, when they wanted me to be keynote speaker, they normally had a topic that the entire event was referencing, or like a topic that they wanted to really just point out. So in those instances, yes, I would speak about whatever topic that they gave me, but I would always ask at the end or at the beginning, was I allowed to say a minute or two about my organization? Because I always wanted my organization to be at the forefront of any speaking event that I did. So I would ask, I'm going to speak about this event. They wanted me to speak 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But I would ask if it was okay for me to say something about RSVP for like a minute or two. Could I do that at the beginning or could I do that at the end? And they were always more than welcoming to allow me to speak, 1 or 2 minutes about RSVP at the beginning or the end. So it kind of depending on what I was there for. So if I was there to speak specifically about RSVP, then that was the entire conversation. But if I was there to speak about a topic, a pre-selected topic, I would always ask if I could speak about RSVP. And I always got a yes. I never got a no with that situation.
Thank you. So the next question, you were talking about your advisory council for your program. So the question is, what was the purpose of your advisory council related to volunteers? What is the makeup of that team?
Okay, so I'll answer the last part of that question first. When I came in as director in 2014, the makeup of my RSVP council, I had 20 members, and every last one of them were Caucasian female, except for one African American male. So that was the makeup when I first got there. The point, if you will, of my advisory council is to help guide and direct decisions that directly affect our volunteer pool. So, for example, they will help with fundraising. They will help with marketing the RSVP brand. They will help, they will be goodwill ambassadors for Golden Triangle RSVP, meaning they will go out into their respective communities and their respective bubbles and talk about RSVP in a positive light whenever given the opportunity. They also would give me ideas and suggestions on, this event is happening in our community, or these people are looking for a speaker, or a lot of them are involved in different organizations, social organizations, civic organizations. And whenever they had maybe an event that came up in their organization, they would invite me and say, Crystal, we're having this event. Can you come out and speak? So they are directly affected, not affected, they are directly impacted with how the RSVP is seen in our community. And they help me broadcast that message, because me as one person, I can only be so many places at one time. But if you have an advisory council of 20 people, of 10 people, then those people can go out into different communities and different neighborhoods and help broadcast your message. I am happy to say, and you'll see pictures later on, that my advisory council is so inclusive right now. It is one of the most things that I am so proud of that has happened over the years.
Thank you for sharing that. And it looks like we may only have one more question, but there are a couple of comments that I wanted to make sure we pointed out to folks. It seems like we have a couple of attendees who have experience working in radio, so they've given some really good tips about those PSAs you talked about. One is just having more than one version of a PSA available, maybe a general interest PSA, and then maybe one that focuses on recruiting volunteers or highlighting any special events that you may have coming up. It seems to give the radio stations more options to rotate those messages. And then also a really good comment about local PSAs, and I'm just going to read it. It says, if you get invited to a local interest program on a radio station, be sure the last thing you do is restate as succinctly as possible what you want the listeners to know: the name of the organization, your contact information, and a call to action. Then the station can clip that last little bit and use it as a PSA or in a news story. And that's especially helpful if you're in a small market where stations are always desperate for local interest stories. And also a suggestion to actually maybe just call the stations in your area and ask if there's a program that you could be a guest on. This person in particular said filling guest slots on his show was always the first priority.
Yes.
So
absolutely true.
I thought those are really good, helpful comments. And then it looks like we got two quick questions about what you were talking about with your advisory board. Was it something that volunteers applied to participate in, or did you select the folks?
It's really dual. About 50% of the time, people apply to be within on the advisory board. Now, one of the draws of the advisory council is you can be any age to volunteer on the advisory council. So you can be 18 or older. Now, with the volunteer pool, you have to be at least 55. So if I was speaking to someone and they're 30 or they're 25 or whatever, they wanted to participate with RSVP, they're not old enough to volunteer, but they're the perfect age to volunteer on the advisory council. And then to answer the second question, I would go out and ask. So as I'm in these communities and I'm seeing maybe a specific person or a couple people who are the leaders, if you will, in these communities, who are hosting events, who are helping, who are picking up trash, I would ask. Because the one thing that I learned from the volunteer that I told you guys about, the African American male, no one ever asked. So that was something that I started intentionally doing, was asking, would you like to be on my advisory council? Here are the benefits of my advisory council. Here are the expectations of being on my advisory council. So I would ask. And a lot of times I would love to do that, and people always seem surprised by the ask, because especially in the minority communities, they don't get the ask a lot. Many people do not ask, do you want to be in a leadership role? Many people do not get the ask, do you want to make decisions that are going to directly affect over 500 people? Do you want that? So they were more than excited to accept that offer. Now, I will say this. When I first brought this to my advisory council. And I want to make sure that you guys understand this. And it goes back to the quote where some people want to preserve what they have and they don't want to change that. So when I initially brought this to my advisory council, letting them know that we need to be more inclusive on the advisory council, we need to be more inclusive with the volunteer pool, I received a lot of pushback. I received a lot of pushback on that because they did not want to. I don't think, that racially they didn't want to be more inclusive. I felt that they didn't want to lose their spot, if you will. So I received a lot of pushback. I received a lot of advisory council members who quit. I received a lot of emails and phone calls, as did my executive director, receive a lot of emails and phone calls. But the people that stayed on started to see by being more inclusive, our advisory council was made that much better, was made that much stronger, and we were able to be in more communities. So it was amazing. But I do want to let you know that sometimes you will get pushback. Sometimes people will quit on you. Sometimes you will get emails that you would rather not get. So just be prepared for that.
Thank you, Crystal. It looks like the last question we had was just about whether or not you could use the techniques you've talked about to recruit board members. And do you have any other recommendations for finding board members?
Now with board members, and I think it depends on how many board members you have. For me, I can have a max of 20 board members. So I have to be really intentional and very strategic about who I want on that board. So the first thing I did before I started recruiting for a more inclusive advisory council or board, if you will, is I made a list of what am I looking for outside of minorities, of course. What am I looking for on my advisory council? I want someone that's bold. I want someone that's confident. I want someone that's working in the community and not someone that's working just to be seen, but someone that's actively working that wants to make a difference in their community. I want someone with fundraising history and experience. I want someone with marketing experience, with branding experience, someone that can tell a story well. So you have to be intentional about exactly what it is you are looking for in your advisory council or your advisory board. So make that list. And then as I was out in the community, as I was at different events, as I was keynote speaker here, or even if I had 5 minutes to speak at this event, I would look for these things in people, making sure that you had 2 or 3 of the things that I was looking for that was going to be an asset to my advisory council. So the suggestions that I made, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can use that, but just be very strategic in using that. Because with that, you can get a broad range, a lot of people that will want to be on your advisory council. But if you can only have 10 or 15 or 20 people on your advisory council, you need to be very selective on who you allow to be on that, because that's a lot of, if you will, power that the advisory council holds over your volunteer organization.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions up to this point, so we'll let you move forward with the rest of your presentation.
Thank you.
And Crystal, I do want to do a quick time check. We have about 15 to 20 minutes remaining.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so in order for me to see what worked as far as recruiting and what did not work, and I'll just kind of start speeding up so I can make sure I make the time, I created an Excel sheet to keep track of who I was recruiting, what was working and what was not working. So measuring helps us see what is otherwise invisible, and it lets us observe things that were once unseen and unknown, but predicted by theory. Next slide, please. So this is one of my actual tracking forms that I had. And as you can see, at the top, it has recruit, volunteer, and then all of the ways that I was recruiting. So we had a commercial on Channel 6. I created a speakers bureau, Facebook, advertising. Now, this is not paid advertising. This is just things that I was doing on Facebook. Site posters, Beaumont Enterprise, that's a local newspaper, KFDM, the Examiner, and any other sources. And so when people would call, I would have my staff ask, how did you hear about RSVP? And then they would say, oh, I seen a commercial on Channel 6. And so I would have my staff put down if this was male, if it was female, if they were Hispanic, Asian, African American, if they were white, so I could go in and see, okay, so my Channel 6 commercial didn't recruit anyone. So I know that maybe next month I'm not going to do a Channel 6 commercial. But I can see on Facebook that Clara Valesco, who's a Hispanic female, just because I put a picture of Clara, and I remember this picture, she's volunteering, we got 4 people that called us and started volunteering with us because of that picture. And then we have Chris Kirkendall, who's an elected official, who started becoming very involved with RSVP. I did the same thing. I showed Chris, who's not a member of RSVP, volunteering with RSVP at an event, and him alone recruited 2 people. So make you a list and track who is calling and asking about your volunteer, about your program, and then just do a tally. You know, Black female called today, she saw a commercial, you know, or she heard a PSA. And then you can see what's working and what's not working, and you can adjust accordingly. And this was just simply something that was set up in Excel spreadsheet, and we would go through it every 6 months. And then at the end of the year, my staff and I would look at the entire year and see what worked and what did not work. And then I would pivot, another one of our P words, I would pivot for the next year on what I need to include or what I need to omit. Next slide, please. And again, I want you to, you know, look at how my volunteer pool started changing over time. So this is not a checkbox system. And I mean, you know, when you recruit maybe an African-American male, you check it off. Whoop, you know, I got me an African-American male, checkbox. I have me a Caucasian male, checkbox. This is not that. You want to be inclusive. You want to get your community involved within your volunteer pool. You want your volunteer pool to be reflective of the community that you serve. When the word priority is used in this context, the underlying meaning to that word is that it is an ongoing priority, meaning that recruiting people of color and men must be a never-ending priority for your organization. So this has to be continuous. I've been director, it'll be 5 years next month. And we started in 2014, and we continue to recruit people of color and to recruit men. But I want to let you know that even in my efforts to target people of color and target male volunteers, that has not in any way lowered or lessened the numbers of my Caucasian volunteers or the female volunteers. In a way, it's actually boosting those numbers. So it has not lessened that at all. And I want to, just repeat what I said at the beginning, that inviting an inclusive volunteer pool and advisory council does not diminish in any way your volunteer pool or your advisory council. If anything, it enhances it and it strengthens your volunteer pool. So make sure this is something you do continuously, that it does not stop. You continue to recruit people of color, and if you need more men, men as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So building a strong, diverse volunteer program that mirrors your community will mean your organization is much better placed to reach people who need or would value your services. As our communities become more diverse, we need to realize that there are benefits to reflecting these changes and disadvantages to not. Dole says you cannot serve your clients in the most effective manner if you do not represent them. And that is the entire thing when it comes to being inclusive. You want to be as effective as possible when you are helping your community. The only way you can do that is by being inclusive, is if people are seeing other people that look like them, that sound like them, that talk like them, that think like them within your organization. If your community does not see that, you are doing a disservice to your community, and you are doing a disservice to the constituents in your community. Next slide, please. So this is how my advisory council looks now. And when I tell you, when I came in 2014, it was Caucasian female and one male volunteer among 20 people. But this is how they look now. And I am so excited. I am so proud when I look at these pictures, because we have males on our advisory council, more than one. We have African American, we have Hispanic. I mean, we have Caucasian, we have African American. So every person has a seat at the table. Everyone is able to voice their opinions. Everyone is able to go out into different communities and talk about the great works of my volunteer organization. And I am very, very proud of this. This was not overnight. This was years and years in the making. Next slide, please. Okay, so after 1 year of strategically and intentionally recruiting for people of color, and this was our breakdown after 1 year. So we recruited and retained, that's very important, 16 male volunteers, 6 African Americans, and 1 Hispanic. So we did all of that in 1 year, and these numbers have continued to grow. My volunteer pool and my advisory council, as you can see, has continued to be more inclusive year by year. And I'm very, very excited about that. But again, this is something that's a priority for me, and it has become a priority for my staff as well. That our volunteer pool and our advisory council be more inclusive, and my organization is better for it, much better for it. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm not going to read all of this. I know it's going to be recorded and placed on the website, but basically it's been 391 years since the word volunteer was introduced. Now, during that time, volunteering was only for Caucasians. So no person of color was able to volunteer at all. So it took 391 years for that to happen. So that's been institutionalized. So if people are only seeing one race do something, then unconsciously they feel like, okay, so that's not for me. That's not something that I can do. So it's going to take just as long to undo that thinking and to undo those biases. to undo those unconscious, unspoken biases. So when I say it has to be a priority, it has to be intentional, and it has to be strategic, this is why it has to be strategic, it has to be intentional, and it has to be a priority to make your volunteer pool or your organization more inclusive. Because for 391 years, it was only for Caucasian people to volunteer and not for anyone else. But whenever you have time and whenever this is posted, please read that. I go into more detail about the importance of it being inclusive and why it should be. Next slide, please. Okay, talent is not equally distributed. Talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not. And if I learned anything from that African-American male volunteer when he said, I've been volunteering 15 years and no one ever asked, this is what that quote means. He has the talent, but the opportunity for him to tell his story was never given to him. In 15 years, it was never given to him. So make sure you are given the opportunity to the people of color in your organization, to the males in your organization, to tell their story, to know that they are valued, and to make them feel valued. Next story, please. Next slide, please. And that is the end. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions and your comments. I feel like we have any more questions or comments, Randy?
Yeah, we did get one just asking how did you gather the racial or cultural background information on the spreadsheet that you showed?
Okay, so what I did, that's an excellent question, and there's a story behind that. So we have a volunteer application that every volunteer has to fill out, because we have to make sure they're 55. We have to make sure that they actually live in our community. So before I got on, there was no place within the application for racial identification. And so when I asked my staff that was there, why was that not there? And basically they were scared to ask the question, because, in this society that we live in, whenever you bring up race, there's fear there's intrepidation that comes along with that. And I was like, add it, put that on our application. So we put that on our application. No one had any issues at all about, filling out their ethnicity. It was not an issue. So that's how I was able to gather that data. So once they filled out the application, we went in and just tabulated that data from the applications. So they would call, and then we would send them an application. And once they filled out that application, we got the application back. We were able to track the information from there.
Thank you. But it looks like the only other question we had, we did get some thank yous, and then one just question about your email address. I don't know if you are open to folks contacting you by email, if you just want to type that in the chat box for folks.
Absolutely. Yes, I am open to that. If you have other questions, or if you would like to brainstorm some suggestions, or even if you're a little fearful about the path that lay ahead, please email me. So I just put in the chat box. My email is cpetrie@setrpc.org.
Great. Normally, I would ask to give Crystal a big round of applause, and I will give Crystal a big round of applause, and you all are welcome to share using the reaction button. I really enjoyed this presentation, and I will say everybody else through the week is going to have a really tough act to follow. I think this was very vital and timely information, and was a great opportunity for us to come together and really discuss some key strategies for bringing our volunteer pool or our boards or advisory councils to reflect our communities, as you said. I saw, Marcia, was that your hand raised? Did you have a question or was that on by mistake? And Marcia, you're still on mute. If you kind of jiggle the mouse, you should see there in the lower right or lower left hand corner how to unmute if you had a question. Oh no, just clap. Okay.
Thank you, Marcia.
So Randy is going to drop a couple of items in the chat box. The first will be an evaluation form for you to share some feedback for Crystal, and then also for our office, how the hosting of this virtual session went. And so please take a few minutes to go ahead and fill that out. We will also follow up at the end of the week with a thank you to all attendees and include that link as well. Also in the chat box, we are going to share a link to the other workshops that are being offered throughout the week, and the registration is still open for all of those. In particular, Crystal mentioned the use of social media in volunteer recruitment, and we have on, I believe it's Wednesday at 9 a.m., a great presentation on using things like TikTok and YouTube and other really cool platforms to be able to enhance your volunteer recruitment. So I invite you to check that out as well. And that's all that we have for today. Thank you all so much for being here. Again, one more big thank you to Crystal for being here and sharing with us and helping us strategize.
Thank you all so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Again, if you guys have questions or insight or comments, please email me, and I will make sure and get back to you as soon as possible. Now go out there and make your volunteer pool more inclusive.